Thank you. And thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. I love geeking out with you on these topics. And here's the thing, right? The 86 million Americans with with insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, whatever you want to call it. There's so many more that have what I call pre-insulin resistance, pre-diabetes. And it's not detectable until I believe that a lot of damage is done the way it's conventionally done. So we want to be looking at our clients. We want to be evaluating every single one of our clients for this situation. Because if we wait till it shows up with, fasting glucose above 100, which is the, kind of cutoff point for pre-diabetes or insulin resistance, if we wait for the hemoglobin A1C to be 5.7 and all the other things that are typically done, there's already been decades of damage that has been happening in the body as the body creeps up towards that level. And I don't even think you have to get to be diabetic to suffer from all these consequences, because not everybody goes on to be diabetic. Yet in the state of insulin resistance before that, I've seen many people who are actually already suffering from the retinopathies, the neuropathies, and had we done early detection with them, they could have been put on the right diet, put on the right supplements, and had that reversed.
Yeah, I love how you say that, because it is true that in pre-diabetes, 90% of people have no symptoms, and so they have no awareness that they even have a problem. And again, pre-diabetes is that blood sugar from 100 to 125 and that A1C of 5.7 to 6.4%. So 90% of people have no symptoms. However, 10% do have symptoms, diabetic neuropathy or problems with retinopathy developing already. And as you know, pre-diabetes in and of itself increases your risk for cancer and for early stroke and heart attack. So pre-diabetes is not a benign condition.
It's not at all. And when you say there's no symptoms, there's no overt symptoms that we would normally associate with diabetes. But in my experience, there are people who are experiencing the day-to-day stuff, the chronic unwellness symptoms. And a lot of times that's just, they're on the path. So the belly fat, just like gaining weight and it's all around my middle and my legs are skinny. What the heck's going on? And I've got, brain fog. I just can't remember things anymore. I'm exhausted, right? Joint pains, little things like that actually, in my experience, have been hallmarks for, they have what I call pre-insulin resistance. So their fasting glucose hasn't hit 100 yet. Maybe it's in the 90s. Maybe it's still in the 80s. But what's happening is they're getting swings. After they eat, they're getting these large spikes and bringing it down. And if we were to start to test their A1Cs as a routine screening, like anytime somebody gets a blood test, even if they're 18, 20, 25, and we can start to see that thing starting to creep up over the years, we're looking at that person as an issue. We look at their waist height ratio, their waist hip ratio. There's a lot of things that are symptoms or signs that we can pick up early. And I believe that we should be doing it. So the three tests that I think are the most critical are fasting insulin, because what's one of the earliest signs that people have is hyperinsulinemia. It's not symptomatic. They're not showing any problems with fasting glucose, hyperinsulinemia, fasting insulin. And then we need to look at hemoglobin A1C and then teaching people how to test their own glucose at home and see what's happening in the peaks.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because high fasting insulin, it is the earliest finding on the road to diabetes.
Right.
And insulin resistance syndrome is underappreciated. Typically by allopathic medicine, doctors rarely check a fasting insulin level. And in fact, many doctors don't approach prediabetes aggressively. Many doctors will just say, hey, watch what you eat and exercise, whatever that means. And they send people out the door. And we're just losing the battle against prediabetes and diabetes. I would say that back in 2014, the CDC thought that there was about 79 million pre-diabetics, and just over a period of 3 years, they had to revise that upward to 86 million, almost 10% increase in 3 years. So we're really, really losing the battle. So I love what you're saying about getting checked early on by checking your fasting insulin. So when you have somebody who you're advising and they're coming to you, those three tests in particular are very helpful. What if they just have a high fasting insulin? What is your approach to that in terms of your nutritional guidance and so on?
Yeah, so high fasting insulin, again, right, it's really early on. It means, okay, they're not getting the up and down swings. They're not getting the big high peaks that would have caused their A1C to go up. So I look at their diet. I look at their lifestyle. So typically, if they're coming through, standard American diet, they're eating too much sugar, they're eating too much pasta, they're eating too much bread, they're eating too much starchy food that's getting converted into sugar, or they're eating just plain too much sugar. And the average American eats 150 pounds of sugar a year. Like, that is like, it just floors me. It's a dumpster full of sugar a year. And I don't eat any. You probably eat very little. And a lot of the people listening here probably don't eat too much. So somebody's getting our share as well. So a lot of people are eating way more than that. It's crazy. It's like 30 teaspoons a day of sugar. And that's actually stressing out the poor pancreas to just keep making insulin, just keep making insulin. And then we get some resistance happening. And boom, we're on the road to long-term damage.
Oh yeah, it's just a disaster. And I can tell you that, like, for me, before I heard the whole sugar story, I was kind of just realizing, man, I just kind of feel terrible when I overeat. You feel, like you said, sluggish and bad and all that kind of stuff. It's really because your blood sugar is having to go so high and releasing massive amounts of insulin to try to bring that blood sugar down. It just doesn't make you feel good. It makes you feel sluggish and memory fog and all those things. But you don't typically relate it to necessarily anything other than, no, I'm kind of tired after I ate, And I think that's the number one thing that I appreciated as I lowered my sugar intake. I really began to notice how much different how I would feel after eating. I would feel refreshed after eating instead of feeling tired and needing to lay down and take a nap. I always know I've eaten too many carbs when it's time for me to take a nap, such as after Thanksgiving.
There you go. And people say that all the time, right? They tell you that, I'm sure. And why is it that I eat this big meal and then I want sweet? I always want a dessert. Well, because you've got all this sugar going into the blood, but it's never getting into the cells. So your hypothalamus never gets the message. You don't get the message that everything's okay now. You just keep wanting more and more and more because it's all sitting out there in the blood. And then when it finally clears from the blood, usually it goes to your belly because it's just, it can't get into the muscle cells. The fat cells are like, okay, feed me, and boom, you get fat.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I have a lot of athletes that come and see me that, they're doing a lot of running and exercising and so on, but they just can't lose that stubborn last 20 pounds or so. And one of the first things I check is a fasting insulin, and many of them end up having high levels of fasting insulin. So they have insulin resistance syndrome, and it can be just a genetic thing. All of us are born with a certain amount of fat cells, and some of us genetically can make more fat cells as we load those fat cells with energy. And of course, energy put into fat cells, we put it in as triglycerides. And so when we get dangerously high on our fat cells, they become unhealthy. And when they become unhealthy, they develop pretty bad insulin resistance. So it's just kind of like this never-ending storm inside our belly fat. And so having a recognition that fasting insulin is a sign of potential problems with the largest endocrine organ in our body, which is our belly fat, is pretty awesome, because it finally, once we fix that fasting insulin, they can finally lose that weight and get rid of that little bit of belly that they've been battling with for so long with just exercise.
Yep.
You do something really cool that I really like. You talk a lot about measuring postprandial glucose levels.
Yep.
There's a standard way to do that, and then there's the way that you do that, and there's a way that other people, like in Europe and so on, do that. And I'm really curious as to, and what I love about what you do is that you actually will look at certain foods, and it really teaches that person, hey, this type of food that you eat really, really increases your blood sugar at 1 hour and 2 hours. Tell us a little bit about what your approach to that is.
Sure. So I think the biggest problem with the conventional, the medical way is taught to diabetics, just check your blood sugar before you eat and 2 hours after, and it shouldn't be more than 140 at 2 hours after. And I'm like, whoa, it should never be 140. So I like to look at it at the peak, and all the studies I've looked at and all the mappings, 45 minutes-ish is when it will peak. It depends, of course, on the carbohydrate load and whether it's, easy to digest carbohydrates, starchy, there's some fat, but, anywhere from a half an hour, I've seen it as long as an hour and a half. And what that means is as the glucose enters the bloodstream, the insulin starts to come out pretty closely aligned. So if we look at glucose curves and we look at insulin curves, they're very, very similar. So the insulin's coming up, the glucose is coming up, and then we reach a peak, and then boom, the insulin, it becomes effective. This is normal person, right? Becomes effective and brings that sugar back down. And we usually see that peak somewhere around 45 minutes, give or take. So I like to measure it so I can catch the peak. So what I teach people is at first when they're starting to test is to test every 15 minutes, which sounds like, oh my God, that sounds like a lot. But if you don't, then you may miss the peak. Like some people, if they just say, I'm going to test it an hour, they may have had their peak at a half an hour, 45 minutes, and they're catching it coming down, and they don't really know how high they got. And I look at the height of that curve as an indication of how well controlled they are. Do they go way up? I've seen people eat like, pure sugar, and boom, it doesn't go up much at all. You've seen that too. And when you look at a glucose tolerance tests, right? Some people doesn't go up at all. And that's with like 100-gram glucose load, and it doesn't go up. So the normal way is that we should be able to have it come up and then come back down. And the experience that I've had and some of the research I've read, somewhere around 110 would be good to keep it below, to keep the peak below 110. And for most people, when they start out, that's a little challenging to do. But then they discover, oh, wow, when I eat, oh, wow, I had a piece of bread and my sugar went up to 130 at the peak. Oh, and I had an avocado with some salad and went up to 90. Right? So we have to figure out what that is. And then we can determine which of the foods that raise it up too high. And then we have them eliminated. I call it a 30-day metabolic reset. So in 30 days, they should be able to give the insulin receptors a rest, because the insulin receptors are constantly bombarded with insulin. They never get a chance to just go back to baseline and actually become more sensitive. And what I find after 30 days of doing this, that the majority of people can actually add back some of the healthier, higher carb foods, like, maybe some blueberries or some pineapple or whatever else it was that raised their sugar before, and now it's not raising it. And all the while in that 30 days, we're working on other factors. We're working on their sleep. We're looking at their stress. We're working at their fitness. We're looking at nutrients that may help to support the insulin receptivity.
Yeah, I love that. I just want to kind of explain to everyone like the standard way that we do it, and then they can even appreciate more the way you're doing it because it's very dynamic. So the standard way that we do it in the United States is we give 75 grams of sugar to someone. We take their blood work first, and then we give them the 75-gram sugar load. And people always say, oh, I can't take that much. They act like it's some huge amount, but if they went through Dairy Queen and got a Blizzard, that's 140 grams of sugar. Okay, so we're giving you half of a Dairy Queen. We think you can handle it. But anyway, they take this 75-gram load, and then after 1 hour, we check the glucose. And some doctors will check insulin. I think it's really good to check glucose and insulin together. And then at 2 hours, we check the glucose and insulin together. And you're exactly right. At 1 hour, it should be less than 140, and at 2 hours, it should be less than 140, or you get diagnosed as having impaired glucose tolerance if you're at 2 hours above 140 on your glucose. It turns out that research shows us that the single greatest predictor of who will go on to develop diabetes is that person who at 1 hour has their blood sugar above 155. And the higher it is above 155 at 1 hour, the higher their risk of going on to develop diabetes is. And so that's the sort of the standard way is to do just a 2 hour test. The integrative doctors are doing more of a 1 hour and a 2 hour insulin and glucose test. And then there's people out there that are like you, that are very dynamic, and you're actually looking at specific dietary interventions. And you're saying, look, we need to work on the sugar problem in a very dynamic way. And we need to find out what it is that's causing your blood sugar to go quite high with certain foods, and you're keeping below a certain range. So that's pretty awesome, because it really gives that person guidance on what to do. Because what happens when they come see us, right? We tell them, hey, you got impaired glucose tolerance. You're going to have to watch what you eat and exercise, and we're just losing the battle.
That's right.
Left
some
and right.
metformin just for good measure.
Yeah, and it turns out that metformin in and of itself doesn't really do much for insulin resistance. It does a little bit for the liver, but it doesn't really do a lot in terms of being a substantial medicine. So there are other things to do, and nutritional intervention is the number one thing that we should all be doing. And of course, genetics is genetics. So some of us, there may be, we actually may eat really well and still go on to develop diabetes. Particularly, I see that in people who hail from India, as an example. they, for whatever reason, have very bad diabetes or genetically, and they could be, of normal body mass index, and they go on to develop type 2 diabetes, and it's very aggressive. So it's very, there's an ethnic difference, there's a genetic difference, and then of course, if mom had diabetes, your risk of having diabetes is high, but if both your parents had diabetes, your risk is even higher. And of course, if you have a higher BMI, your risk is higher. If your HDL is lower, your risk is higher. If you're Hispanic, your risk is higher. So there's all sorts of, risk things that we talk about. But what I love about your approach is you're a solution, and it's a dynamic solution. And we just don't have that as a solution. So you, you're going to be coming out with a program here pretty soon. I don't know if you want to talk about it now.
Yeah, I can talk about it.
But it seems like it has the word solution in it, from what I recall.
It has the word solution, right? I'm very solution driven.
Yeah, and I wasn't really even just trying to tee that up. I just was thinking, wow, that's awesome that you actually have the word solution in there, because to me, that's what you do offer. That's different, than what.
Yeah, it's just not monitor and wait and see. And then because I've had people come into my program because they went to the doctor, had their fasting glucose, and it was 118, and the doctor said, hey, you're getting close to diabetes. And they said, oh, wow, what do? I don't want to get diabetes. My mom had it. My uncle had it. They had horrible complications. What do I do? And they said, just come back in 6 months, and if you're diabetic, we'll put you on medication.
And the interesting thing is, the truth is, they may already have diabetes, because the best test is actually a 2-hour glucose tolerance test for the pre-diabetic, because many of those pre-diabetics will end up having a glucose that's much higher at 2 hours than the diagnostic criteria, which is above 200 at 2 hours. That's diabetes. I had many pre-diabetics who came in with blood sugars of 118. We did a 2-hour glucose tolerance test, and they actually had diabetes already, and which changes the approach. We're a little bit even more aggressive. But I love that, because if a person does have pre-diabetes, they need answers. And I don't think we're giving them very good answers right now, other than watch your weight and exercise. And people don't even know what that necessarily.
They don't even know what it means. What does it mean to watch your weight and exercise? Yeah, watch my weight. I'll watch it increase year after year.
Right. Yeah, watch your weight and exercise, and and then nutrition. We don't spend a lot of time talking to patients about nutrition, and I don't think doctors understand the enormity of the problem with just added sugars alone. You mentioned it. So many pounds of sugar per year, unbelievable. The World Health Organization talks about grams of sugar intake per day. They really want it less than 25. The average American's at about 150 to 200 grams per day. So we have a major crisis, and I think the more of us that are out there talking about it, and for you, it's awesome. You're providing a solution for people. So if you know of someone that's out there and you're watching this right now, either a family member or a friend, or maybe you're a health coach and you have clients that are concerned about their blood sugar, maybe they've been told they had diabetes or pre-diabetes or whatnot. There are solutions out there, like Ritamarie's solutions. So I really encourage you guys to look into it.
I'm going to just take it a step further, right? It's not just people who who think they have a blood sugar imbalance. And that's why we go through an assessment to say, do you think you do? I have an insulin resistance quiz. But the thing is that so many people who are just suffering those very early, what I call the tip of the iceberg symptoms, right? That, like you said, tired after eating a meal. All of these things are indicative of your body's not handling glucose properly, or you're overtaxing the mechanism, one or the other. And it doesn't mean you're diabetic. It doesn't mean you're pre-diabetic. But like I said, he invented the term pre-insulin resistance. And that's the time to catch it, because in those decades where it's constantly going up and down, whenever it's going up, you're causing damage to your peripheral nerves. You're causing damage to the retinas. And one of my people who went through this program last year, she went in for her annual eye exam, and the eye doctor said, you have diabetes. And she goes, no, I don't. He said, yeah, you have diabetes. It's showing in your retina. She goes, but my doctor's never told me that. So he sent a report over to the doctor. The doctor said, your fasting glucose is fine. Showing the program, and she starts testing. And sure enough, she's getting these huge spikes after eating so-called healthy foods, right? And so she went on the program. She lost a bunch of weight. She's feeling so much better. She goes back in to get the eyes tested again. And sure enough, reversed in a year. Her husband was already diabetic. Right. And he was on metformin, and he's going through all this stuff and been that way for years. He did the program with her. He dropped the weight. And now a year later, his hemoglobin A1C is 4.8. He's off great. Metformin, and everything is perfect. And he's, his HDLs are good. They went up. His cholesterol and triglycerides came down. So this is stuff that works for the diabetics, but it also works for the people who don't know they're diabetic. And I think personally, I think that screening test, that fasting insulin, you take your 18-year-old, check their fasting insulin, check it on a regular basis. If it's fine, great. Check it again in 5 years. If it's not, keep checking it, because if it's going in the wrong direction, you're heading for disaster. Even if you never get diabetes, you're still going to get those dangers.
Yeah, what I love about you is you've learned how to leverage labs to improve outcomes through compliance, right? Because it is hard to change a person's way of eating. It's hard to make those difficult choices and changes. But if they have the data right in front of them where they can see, hey, you know, this is what's happening with my blood sugar and this is the problem, and they're being educated along the way about how this is actually going to prolong their life, you know, it's a big deal, because diabetics will not live as long as they could if they didn't have diabetes. So it truly can be life prolonging for them to intercept this early on.
Plus quality of life, right? Because how many of those type 2 diabetics go on to wear out their pancreas and end up having to go on insulin?
All right. And the first thing that happens when you put somebody on insulin, I know this as a doctor, you know, we put somebody on insulin, they gain 20 or 30 pounds. Insulin's a fat fertilizer. It fluctuates up and down every time they give themselves shots. It's never sort of this perfect steady state. And it's problematic. And, you know, that person picks up another 20, 30 pounds, and then they start changing their cholesterol patterns. Even in insulin resistance, we see this. When a person has high fasting insulin, they stop making the large buoyant LDL cholesterol, and they begin making the small dense cholesterol. And therefore, and that is one of the reasons why they're at increased risk. The other for heart attack and stroke, the other reason they're at increased risk for heart attack and stroke is they start to elevate their HSCRP, or their inflammatory marker. And when that goes above 2, that's an independent risk factor for stroke and heart attack. So the metabolic disturbance of just insulin resistance, not prediabetes or diabetes, just insulin resistance can cause elevations of inflammatory markers to the point where it puts them at risk. So yeah, all these things kind of work together. And, you know, you talk about checking cholesterol numbers too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the triglyceride HDL ratio is super important.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us about triglycerides and so on, and how you use those when you're talking to your clients.
Yeah. So personally, I like to see that the triglyceride HDL 1, right? If it goes above 1, where the triglycerides are more than the HDLs, you're starting to get into risk. And at 2, you're at fairly significant risk. So I like to see that done. And most labs don't even calculate that ratio. I mean, obviously it's an easy ratio to calculate. You look at it and you do 7th grade or 4th grade division. But I think it's an important marker that nobody's really looking at other than functional medicine practitioners like we are. And I think it's a really important one to do. So people will say, well, look, my fasting glucose is 85. The doctor said I'm fine, but look, your triglycerides are 175 and your HDLs are 42. That's huge risk. And there's something going on in your blood sugar pathways, and we need to know what that is. I mean, it's not conclusive that that's it. They could have, you know, congenital hypertriglyceridemia, but everybody I work with this, without exception, their triglycerides come down, their HDLs come up when they do all the components that we teach.
Yeah, and that does make sense. One of the risk factors for development of diabetes is having a low HDL. It's actually one of the things they found in lots and lots of research. They actually have it in the San Antonio diabetes risk factor calculation. They have HDL as a low HDL is an increasing risk factor. So it's important. The other issue with triglycerides, right, the more carbs you eat, the more carbs you store. And when you store carbs in belly fat, you store them as triglycerides. And so I use triglyceride measurements as the way to monitor a person's nutritional compliance with the program. So obviously, if they're eating a ton of carbs, those triglycerides are going to stay high. And if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, we'll start to see those triglycerides drop significantly. So that's awesome. I love the fact that you pay attention to that ratio. I think it's important. A ratio of 1's pretty hard to hit, though. I can tell you. not for you guys, because you're checking your monitors very frequently, but for most patients, it's very hard for them to hit that, because if you think about it, triglycerides have to be well under 100 for most people. Very few people have super high HDL. We pray. I mean, I pray to try to get men above 50. I mean, that's really typically hard for me to do. Yeah, it's hard. Women a little bit easier, but men are much harder. But that's awesome. It just means you have a very strict and tight protocol.
And not everybody gets there, but I'm just saying 1 to 2, definitely closer to 1 than to 2. And I think the triglycerides need to be 75. I mean, you and I've had that discussion on things before. 75 or 50 to 75 is probably really good for triglycerides.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very good for triglycerides. Yeah, it's very good. Most people that I see have triglycerides, couple hundred, 300, 400, and all that. I mean, it's just pretty,
those real sick people.
yeah, pretty typical. They don't even know it. They just
They
came
don't know it
because they're feeling kind of bad, but and many of them end up having diabetes already. So it is important. The other thing with the cholesterol panel that I mentioned is insulin resistance, prediabetes, and so on can change your lipid subclasses. So you tend to have less of the HDL larges, which are the most protective, and you tend to have more pattern B, which is the most damaging type of LDL cholesterol, the small dense cholesterol. And so literally by changing a person's diet, good, strong nutritional intervention, you can oftentimes change them to a pattern A where they have the large buoyant LDL that aren't as damaging to the arteries. So, and of course the triglycerides go down and the HDL large goes up. And so all these can be monitored with an advanced lipid panel as well.
Yep.
Are there other?
That's part of a good screening. I mean, not necessarily for everybody in the world, but if you have a family history of diabetes, a family history of heart disease, then that should be routine. That should be checked real early on. And, I've told you the story with my family, my parents. I think if they had had that done, they probably would have found problems between the insulin resistance stuff and the advanced panel that could have prompted them to do interventions.
Yeah, well, I'm a big advocate in of these preventative tests when a person is motivated to do it and they'll take action on the results.
Right.
And so I encourage every single person out there to get screened across the board, for insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes, but also with an advanced lipid panel to look at some of these things because it is important. It can really be life-saving for people if they realize the importance of it. Are there other things that you want to talk about in terms of your approach to what's going on in your program and what you want to tell people about it? It's going to be launching pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, we're starting with a bunch of really nice free content. We've got 4 videos and we've got some really nice handouts. So if you know anybody or if you're interested in getting in it, as a practitioner, I think most of your people in this group are mostly health coaches. Is that right?
Yeah, health coaches, nutritionists, doctors, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So people who are health practitioners. This is for the clients, for the people who need the work. What I find is that most people who are practitioners need the work as well. And then in June, we're going to launch our practitioner version of, how do you get people doing the blood sugar? How do you actually work with people and coach them through it? But, the approach is, I call it the 5 essential lifestyle factors that need to be addressed. Because a lot of folks will say, well, I'm eating all the right foods, but I'm still having an issue. Well, are you sleeping? What's your stress level like? Cortisol will raise your blood sugar big time, right? How are you moving? Are you doing it on a regular basis? We find that burst training, like short bursts of high intensity, tends to do better for bringing down insulin levels and blood sugar levels than does, those long, like, let's just sit on the exercise bike for an hour. And then timing is super important. So sleep, stress, food. What did I miss? Sleep, stress, food, fitness, and timing. Mm-hmm. And the timing's super important. And people are eating like 4 or 5 times a day because somebody told them that that's the best way to maintain their weight. And think about this. Every time you eat, your blood sugar goes up, insulin is secreted. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. It stores fat. It actually disrupts lipolysis or lipolysis, however you want to say it. But the breakdown of fat, it actually interferes with that. You can't do it. It interferes with growth hormone, which is, the anabolic that it helps you to build muscle, right? So when you're eating all day long, you've just got a steady state of insulin in your body. And we know what happens. You said what happens when people take insulin, right? So that's the same thing that's happening when you secrete insulin all day long. You're going to gain weight in spite of the fact that maybe you're eating a decent caloric diet. So that's the big thing. And so I have people spread their meals out. Some people go to 2 meals a day. Some people 3, 4 to 6 hours between the meals. Spread out the distance between dinner and bedtime, because if you go to bed on a full stomach, you're thwarting the growth hormone release. You're increasing the insulin release. You're impacting the leptin flow during the night. So all of these things play in. So timing is super important. We have a whole bunch of different timing guidelines that we teach.
So when you're talking about this program, is it a weight loss program or is the side effect weight loss
Side
for
effect
people?
is weight loss.
Okay, that's a great side
Side
effect.
effect is weight loss. Yes,
Yeah.
it's a health program. It's here to help you to get over those symptoms that I believe are early signs of insulin dysregulation and glucose dysregulation.
Well,
And
it sounds like
don't.
potentially this program can be for anyone, right?
Yes,
Because to know early on is key, and then of course we can always optimize and get better, and we can always take a little bit of pressure off our pancreases, no matter what our condition is at this point in time. And
absolutely.
our pancreas live longer. That's just the way it
Absolutely.
works.
Like, and the pancreas makes digestive enzymes. I mean, it's a different part of the pancreas, but still, we don't want to stress out an organ that's so critical to being healthy and alive.
Well, I absolutely love what you're doing. I'll put a link below where people can go and get more information. And you mentioned there's a lot of free resources that are available. And so
Yeah.
you can sign up and get Ritamarie's free resources and then have a potential solution for your clients, yourselves, your friends and family, and so on. We're always looking
Right.
for integrative ways to provide solutions. And you're a
Absolutely.
great integrative practitioner
Thank
who's super smart with tons of training. Oh my gosh. I remember
you.
the time you told me your background, I just could not believe it. I was like,
I
you
just am
have
a maniac for, I'm a what an addict, an information and knowledge junkie. But the thing is, and as health coaches, as doctors, nurses, wherever you are with that relationship with people, I believe it's really important to understand the underlying mechanism, which is why I love your course, because it's teaching people how this stuff works. It's not just giving them a set of rules and protocols to follow. Like medicine, as you know, you're Western trained in medicine. What are some of the drugs you use for this disease? What are some of the drugs? What are the interventions? And there's not a lot of like, oh, well, I'm going to do a novel approach to this. You get your hand slapped when you try to do, off-label uses of various things. So it's like, what is really going on in the biochemistry and the anatomy physiology that we can say, oh, wow, this is what's happening. Because when inevitably people don't respond the way you think they should.
Oh yeah. Well,
Okay, why? Let's think why. Let's ask why. Why?
yeah, it's really hard to help people unless they really understand. And it's awesome to actually be able to have tools out there to help us understand and get a better education, because with a better education, we are going to have better outcomes. And I
Absolutely.
really strongly believe in that. And that's why I appreciate everything that you bring to the table, because you're constantly coming out with tons of really great educational materials. And you're a leader in this sugar issue. That's for sure.
Mhm. I'm passionate about it.
Yes, you are. And anybody that's ever had dinner with Rita Marie will know that she actually lives the life. Okay. It's not like she talks about it and then she's out eating, cake or whatever. And maybe she's had
No,
birthday cake once or twice. I do not know.
no,
Probably.
I haven't done it in 32 years. I
Probably.
haven't had any that in 32 years. Nothing.
Yeah, but I mean, but if you actually, you see her, you meet her, you're like, you can tell. I mean, she's a picture, perfect health, and she's just happy and vibrant and so full of so much energy. So it does really make a difference. And I am here to tell you, she definitely 100% practices what she preaches.
Absolutely.
That is so true, and I'm so proud of you for that. So I will put the link below where people can go to get more information. And is there anything else that you wanted to say in summary?
In summary, yeah, I don't take the little chronic problems that people complain about as just nuisances, right? And as health coaches, we tend to take that more serious. But as medical doctors, we tend to be like, oh, let's just, yeah, you're a little tired. Everybody's tired. You feel brain foggy. What does that mean? Maybe you have ADD. We'll send you off to site. They're just like these symptoms that I believe are the tip of the iceberg that are just hallmarking that there's a dysfunction. At least rule it out. At least get the fasting insulin. At least get them to do the hemoglobin A1C. But here's the other thing I think is so important. And I wish, hopefully in the next couple of years, it's going to be all over. The CGMs, the continuous glucose meters, because a lot of people don't want to poke their finger, that many times a day. And it's a little patch you can put on your arm, and you just hold up your meter and you go, I don't have one on right now because I was taking vitamin C, and vitamin C interferes with the response. You know, you get extra high readings. It's like, why am I wasting my money? But I like to wear it because I like to watch. And then if you forget to test, that's fine, because it keeps a graph and you can just look it up, as long as you test every 8 hours. So I think those should be like, everybody should at one point in their life get a CGM that they wear for a month and just be able to track the effective exercise, stress, sleep is huge, and the foods on their glucose. So one of these days, that's going to be the norm in my world, where, you know, my vision is this world where everybody is conscious of this stuff and nobody has to get unnecessary diseases.
Yeah, well, you're definitely conscious of that, because I remember when you came over to my house to eat, you were wearing one of those monitors and you were checking it with your phone. And
Yes.
so I was like, wow, this is crazy. She is just so on it. So you knew exactly what your blood sugar was, which kind of put the pressure on me to feed you well, I guess. But
Yeah, there you go. Or I wouldn't have eaten.
well, I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your knowledge and all the information. And in this program that's going to be launched, I think could be a great resource for all those health coaches out there that, you know, have clients that, you know, may need just like a little programmatic, you know, approach to things, and pretty awesome. So, we'll put the link down in a few minutes so you guys can click on it, get more information, sign up to receive all the resources that Ritamarie has. All right, Ritamarie. Well, thanks for being on our program today.
Thanks for having me. I love it. Anytime you want me back to talk about whatever geeking out subjects we can, I'm happy to come back.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for being on, and we'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.